I accidentally found a $200,000 receipt in my husband's coat pocket. He said we were poor for 15 years, and we lived modestly. The receipt was for buying a house. When I drove there and saw who opened the door— Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me how I could have lived with a man for 43 years and not known. I ask myself the same question some mornings when I sit at the kitchen table with my coffee and stare at the chair where Harold used to read his newspaper. The answer, I think, is simple and terrible at the same time. I trusted him completely. And trust, when it's that deep, is really just another word for blindness. We weren't wealthy people. Harold made that clear from the very beginning of our marriage. He was an accountant at a mid-size firm in Columbus, Ohio, and I was a retired schoolteacher. And together, we lived what I can only describe as a careful life. We clipped coupons on Sunday mornings. We drove our cars until the wheels practically fell off. We hadn't taken a real vacation since our trip to Niagara Falls in 2004. Every time I mentioned fixing the roof or replacing the washing machine that sounded like a helicopter taking off, Harold would sigh in that patient, exhausted way of his and say, "Dorothy, we just don't have it right now." And I believed him. Every single time. Our daughter Karen had long since moved to Phoenix with her husband and their 2 children. We saw her at Thanksgiving, sometimes Christmas. Our son Michael lived closer, about 40 minutes away in Westerville, but he was busy with his contracting business and called when he remembered. Harold and I lived the quiet life of 2 people who had made their peace with ordinariness. I tended my garden. He watched his baseball. We ate dinner at 6 o'clock every evening and went to bed at 10. For years, that felt like enough. The first crack, looking back, appeared about 2 years before I found the check. It was a Thursday evening in November. Harold had been to what he described as a work dinner, something that was becoming increasingly common. And he came home with a particular kind of quiet about him. Not tired, quiet. Secret quiet. There's a difference. I noticed it the way you notice a smell that's slightly off in a room. Well, I didn't say anything. I filed it away. Then there were the phone calls. Harold had always been someone who left his cell phone on the kitchen counter. Around that same period, he started keeping it in his shirt pocket, always face down. I told myself he was just getting more protective of his privacy, the way older people sometimes do with technology. I told myself a lot of things. There was an afternoon in March when I called him at the office to ask about dinner plans, and his assistant, a young woman named Priya, who had always been perfectly pleasant, paused just a half-second too long before saying he was in a meeting. Something about that pause settled into my stomach like a cold stone. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I felt it. And then there was the money. Small things mostly. A credit card statement I happened to glance at that showed 3 charges from a restaurant called Marigold in the Short North neighborhood, a neighborhood Harold had never mentioned visiting and where he had no reason to be. A receipt I found in the console of his car for 2 glasses of wine on a Tuesday afternoon. A $400 ATM withdrawal I couldn't account for. When I asked, his explanations were always smooth, always reasonable. Client entertainment. A retirement gift for a colleague. I let myself be reassured. I want to be honest with you. I didn't want to know. That's the part that's hardest to admit. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I had started to sense the shape of something terrible, and I chose, consciously or not, to keep it in the shadows. Because I was 68 years old. Because the life I had built with Harold was the only life I knew. Because some discoveries, once made, cannot be unmade. But then came the coat. It was a Saturday in late October. One of those cold, gray days that make you feel like winter arrived overnight. Harold had asked me to drop his wool overcoat at the dry cleaner on my way to the pharmacy. I was checking the pockets the way you do before laundry, pulling out old tissues and receipts. And that's when my fingers closed around a folded piece of paper that was heavier than it should have been. I unfolded it at the kitchen table, still wearing my reading glasses from the crossword puzzle I'd been working on. It was a cashier's check made out to a property management company. The amount was $200,000. The memo line read, "Deposit, 14 Wexford Lane." I sat there for a very long time, holding that check with both hands, while the kitchen clock ticked and the furnace hummed, and the world outside continued as though nothing had happened. $200,000. A house. A deposit. We were poor, Harold had told me. We couldn't afford a new washing machine. I set the check down on the table very carefully, as if it might shatter. And then I picked up my car keys. The drive to Wexford Lane took 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard the entire way, as if the numbers could anchor me to something solid. The neighborhood was one I recognized, a newer development on the east side of Columbus, the kind of subdivision with matching mailboxes and young trees still staked with wire. Modest but not cheap, certainly not poor people real estate. I parked across the street from number 14. It was a beige colonial with black shutters and a front porch that still had a for sale sign in the yard, though it had been crossed out with red tape. There was a light on in the front room. A minivan sat in the driveway. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I recognized the minivan. I crossed the street and knocked on the door. It opened after a moment, and I found myself looking at a woman I had met exactly twice before. Once at Harold's office Christmas party 7 years ago, and once at a neighborhood barbecue that a mutual colleague had hosted. Her name was Renee Marsh. She was 51 years old, 17 years younger than Harold. She had dark hair, now shorter than I remembered, and she was wearing an apron with what appeared to be tomato sauce on the hem. She looked at me the way people look at something they hoped would never materialize. Not surprise, exactly. More like the confirmation of a long-dreaded nightmare. We stared at each other for approximately 5 seconds without speaking. Then she said very quietly, "Mrs. Calloway." I didn't answer. I looked past her into the hallway and saw, hung on the wall, a photograph. Harold and Renee on what appeared to be a beach vacation. Harold smiling the way I hadn't seen him smile in years. Below the photograph, a child's backpack on a hook. A small pair of sneakers on the mat. "How old is the child?" I asked. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she said, 7. I nodded once. I turned and walked back to my car. I drove home in a kind of white silence that I don't have the vocabulary to fully describe. My hands were steady on the wheel. My mind was extraordinarily calm. The way it gets, I've noticed, in the moments of greatest shock, as if the brain protects itself by going very, very still. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark for 20 minutes. Then I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and allowed myself to understand the full scope of what Harold had done. He had a second family, a woman 17 years his junior, a child who was 7 years old, meaning this had begun when I was 61, when Harold had told me our retirement savings had taken a hit and we needed to cut back. He had been funding a parallel life for nearly a decade, possibly longer, while I clipped coupons and postponed dental work and felt guilty about wanting new kitchen curtains. $200,000 for their house. And not a word to me. The fear came later, around midnight, when I was lying awake in our bed staring at the ceiling. Not fear of Harold. Whatever I had felt for him had undergone a rapid and complete chemical change. Fear of the practical reality of what I was facing. I was 68 years old. I had not worked in 11 years. My name was on our house, yes, but was it on our savings accounts? Our investment accounts? I genuinely didn't know. Harold had always handled the finances. I had let him, the way women of my generation were taught, to let their husbands handle things. What did I actually have? What was actually mine? That question, cold and precise, was what pulled me out of fear and into action. By 2 a.m, I was at Harold's desk in the study, going through files. I was systematic about it, the way I used to be when organizing my classroom. I pulled out bank statements, investment summaries, insurance documents, tax returns. I made a careful pile and photographed every document with my phone. It took 3 hours. What I found both terrified and clarified me. There were accounts I hadn't known existed. There were assets Harold had never mentioned. There was also a separate cell phone, a prepaid one, in the back of his desk drawer, and on it, a text thread with a contact labeled simply R. I put everything back exactly as I had found it. I showered, dressed, and sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, waiting for Harold to come downstairs for breakfast, as though nothing had happened. That was the plan for now. Appear normal, say nothing, give him no warning. Because the first thing I was going to do, the very first thing, was call a lawyer. I called the law office of Sandra Okafor on Monday morning. I'd seen her name on a billboard years ago, and, for reasons I couldn't have explained at the time, it had stayed with me. A divorce and family law attorney with 22 years of experience, according to her website. I made the call from my cell phone in the parking lot of the Kroger, while Harold believed I was grocery shopping. Sandra Okafor was a compact, precise woman in her early 50s, with close-cropped natural hair and a manner that reminded me of a very efficient surgeon. She asked questions with the kind of calm that told me she had heard worse. She didn't flinch at any of it. When I slid my folder of photographed documents across her desk, she put on her reading glasses and went through them methodically, making small notes in the margins of her legal pad. "You did well to document before alerting him," she said when she was finished. "Many women don't think of that. It's a critical advantage." She explained my situation plainly. Ohio is an equitable distribution state, meaning marital assets are divided fairly, though not necessarily equally. Everything accumulated during the marriage was potentially subject to division, including accounts Harold had tried to keep separate. The $200,000 cashier's check was significant. If it could be proven that marital funds were used to purchase a home for a romantic partner, that constituted dissipation of marital assets, which a court could factor heavily into a settlement. "He's been siphoning money," Sandra said. "For years, it seems," I said. "Then we need a forensic accountant, and we need to move carefully." She looked at me over her glasses. "Mrs. Calloway, has he given any indication he knows you've found anything?" "None," I said. "I've been very normal." She nodded approvingly. "Keep being normal. Don't move any money. Don't confront him. Don't speak to anyone who might tell him." "Can you do that?" I told her I could. I was a schoolteacher for 35 years. I knew how to maintain a neutral expression, but even as I sat in Sandra's office feeling something close to competent, I wasn't aware of what was already beginning to unravel on the other end. Because Renee Marsh was not a foolish woman. She had looked at my face on her doorstep, that particular face of a wife who has just seen the confirmation of everything, and she had understood immediately what it meant. And Renee, whatever else she was not someone inclined to remain passive. Harold called me that same evening to say he'd be home late. "Client dinner," he said. His voice was perfectly even. I said that was fine and asked if he wanted me to leave him a plate. What I didn't know until later was that he had gone directly to Renee's new house on Wexford Lane, and the two of them had spent 3 hours trying to decide what to do about me. The direct evidence arrived 10 days later. Sandra's forensic accountant, a methodical man named Gerald Park, spent 2 weeks reconstructing Harold's financial history. What he found was meticulous in its deception. A pattern of cash withdrawals. A brokerage account opened 11 years ago that Harold had never disclosed. Regular wire transfers to a joint account held by Harold and Renee. And, most damning of all, a life insurance policy worth $850,000, on which Harold had changed the beneficiary 6 years ago. Renee Marsh was named as the sole beneficiary. Not me, not our children, Renee. Sandra called me on a Thursday afternoon to give me the summary. I sat in my living room and listened to her voice on the phone, and I remember looking at the framed wedding photograph on the bookshelf. Harold in his rented tuxedo, me in my mother's altered dress, both of us 25 years old and absolutely certain about each other. And I felt something in me go very quiet and very hard. "Dorothy," Sandra said, "this is your point of no return. Once we file, there's no keeping it quiet. He'll know, she'll know. It will move quickly and it will be unpleasant. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at that photograph for one more moment. Then I reached over and laid it face down on the shelf. "File," I said. Sandra filed the petition for divorce in Franklin County Common Pleas Court on a Friday morning. Harold was served at his office at 2:15 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because Sandra's paralegal texted me the moment it was done. I was in my garden when the text came through, planting bulbs for the spring. I read the message, put the phone back in my pocket, and kept planting. Whatever Harold was feeling in that moment in his office, whatever shock or panic or calculation was moving across his face, I was no longer responsible for managing it. That was a new feeling. I found I didn't entirely dislike it. Harold came home that night carrying the service papers in his briefcase. He set them on the kitchen table in front of me with a kind of theatrical calm, as if I were a student who had turned in an unexpected assignment. "Dorothy," he said, "what is this?" I had rehearsed for this moment with Sandra. I kept my hands folded on the table and my voice level. "I think the document explains itself, Harold." The mask held for about 30 seconds. Then it slipped. He began to talk, quickly, in that low, controlled voice he used when he was actually furious, about how I was making a catastrophic mistake, about how I didn't understand the full picture, about how these things are complicated, and I was reacting emotionally, and couldn't I please just talk to him before doing something we couldn't undo? He said the word emotional 3 times in 5 minutes. I counted. "I've retained legal counsel," I said. "All further communication can go through Sandra Okafor's office." He stared at me as if I had suddenly become someone he didn't recognize. Perhaps I had. The following week, Sandra moved quickly. We filed a motion to freeze the known marital accounts to prevent Harold from further dissipation of assets. The court granted a temporary restraining order on the brokerage account, the one Harold had hidden for 11 years. Gerald Park's findings were formally submitted. Harold's attorney, a man named Douglas Hearn, who specialized in shielding assets for clients, exactly like Harold, began sending aggressive letters. Sandra called them noise and advised me to let her handle it. I moved the things that mattered to me. My mother's jewelry, the photograph albums, my personal documents, to Karen's house in Phoenix, which I'd arranged during a quiet phone call with my daughter the week before. Karen had cried on the phone, a long, quiet cry, and then said, "Mom, what do you need?" That question, so simple and so immediate, nearly undid me. I told her I needed her to hold some boxes. She said she'd be on the first flight if I said the word. I told her not yet. I needed to be steady. It was Renee who made the first direct move. She came to my house. I opened the front door to find her standing on my porch on a Wednesday evening. She was dressed carefully, as if she had thought about what to wear. She asked if she could come in. I stood in the doorway without moving. "I think you should leave," I said. She didn't leave. Instead, she began talking. About Harold, about their history, about her daughter. Her daughter, the 7-year-old, Harold's daughter, that fact still striking me like a physical thing each time it surfaced. She said she wasn't my enemy. She said she was also, in her own way, a victim of Harold's dishonesty. She said things that were probably designed to make me feel sympathy, and some of them, if I'm being honest, nearly worked. She was a reasonably articulate and not unintelligent woman, and she clearly believed at least part of what she was saying. But then she said, "If you proceed with this, Dorothy, Harold's attorney is prepared to argue that you have early-stage dementia. There are people who will testify to it." The air on the porch went very still. "He has documentation," she continued. "A doctor's report. I'm telling you this because I don't want things to get ugly. I'm telling you so you understand what's at stake." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, very quietly, "Thank you for coming by, Renee. Please don't do it again." I closed the door. I went to the kitchen, sat down, and called Sandra. Sandra's response to the dementia threat was crisp and immediate. "We would request my full medical records and submit them to the court, along with a cognitive assessment from a neurologist of our choosing." "They're bluffing," she said. "But even if they're not bluffing, we expose it in daylight. Sunlight is always your friend in a courtroom." The bluff was indeed a bluff. My neurologist's report described my cognition as entirely within normal range for age, with no markers of concern. Harold's attorney received a copy within the week. The threat evaporated. When the legal maneuvering died down for a moment, the accumulated weight of it hit me all at once. One Saturday morning, I simply sat in my garden and cried. Not desperately, not loudly, just steadily, the way rain falls when it means to last all day. I let myself be sad for a woman I had been for 43 years. Then I went inside, washed my face, and began planning the next step. The offer came through Douglas Hearn's office on a Tuesday. Sandra called me about it while I was eating lunch at my kitchen table. A grilled cheese sandwich, the radio on low, a perfectly ordinary afternoon. The terms, according to Sandra, were as follows. Harold would transfer ownership of the marital home to me outright. He would provide a lump sum payment of $180,000. I would receive a modest monthly payment for 3 years, after which all financial obligations between us would end. In exchange, I would sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, withdraw my dissipation claim regarding the Wexford Lane property, and agree not to pursue the undisclosed brokerage account or the life insurance beneficiary change in court. Sandra read the terms in her steady, clinical voice. There was a pause when she finished. "He wants me to go away quietly," I said. "In exchange for a sum that represents considerably less than your probable entitlement under full equitable distribution." "Yes," Sandra said. "My honest estimate is that full litigation could yield you 2 to 3 times this amount, plus the brokerage account, plus potential damages for asset dissipation. But litigation takes time, costs money, and carries uncertainty. This is your decision to make, Dorothy, not mine." I thought about it for a full 3 seconds. "Decline," I said, "and let Douglas Hearn know that we will be pursuing the brokerage account, the insurance policy, and full documentation of the Wexford Lane transaction." Sandra said, "Good." I could hear in her voice that this was the answer she had expected. I put the phone down and finished my grilled cheese. What Harold had hoped, I think, was that the combination of the dementia threat and the financial offer would produce a particular effect in a 68-year-old woman living alone, that I would feel isolated, frightened, and financially uncertain enough to take the first safe thing extended to me. He had known me for 43 years, and he still fundamentally misunderstood me. Or perhaps he'd simply never paid close enough attention. But in the days that followed, I noticed things. A car I didn't recognize parked for long stretches on my street. Harold driving slowly past the house on a Sunday afternoon when I happened to be pulling weeds near the front walk. A call from a number I didn't know that rang twice and disconnected. Small surveillances. The behavior of people who have a great deal to lose and are trying to gauge whether their opponent truly understands that. I behaved as though I noticed nothing. The social support found me rather than the other way around. A neighbor of mine, a woman named Bet Hargrove, had noticed the changes in my life with the antenna of a person who has been through similar changes herself. Bet was 72, divorced 12 years earlier, and possessed of a dry, unsentimental intelligence that I had always found quietly impressive. One afternoon, she knocked on my door with a casserole and a bottle of reasonably good wine and said, "I heard some things. You don't have to tell me anything, but you shouldn't be eating alone every night." So I told her. Not everything at once, but over 2 evenings on my back porch. The whole of it. Bet listened with the stillness of someone who has processed enough pain of her own to hold space for someone else's without flinching. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "You know what the worst part of it is? Not the money. Not even the other woman. It's the years you spent feeling small when you didn't need to." That sentence moved something in me that hadn't been moved in a long time. Bet introduced me to 2 other women in our neighborhood who had been through late-life divorces, Patricia, 65, and Sue Jin, 70. We met for coffee one Thursday morning, and then again the following week, and the week after that. They didn't offer advice so much as the practical clarity of people who had survived a thing and come out the other side still standing. Patricia, who had once been too afraid to open her own bank account, now ran a small bookkeeping business. Sujin had traveled to South Korea to visit family she hadn't seen in 20 years, once she was free to make her own decisions. These women were, in a completely unglamorous and practical way, the most fortifying thing that happened to me in those months. I was not alone. I was not confused. I was not a woman in cognitive decline to be managed and maneuvered around. I was Dorothy Calloway, retired school teacher, and I knew how to outlast people who underestimated me. Harold and Renee were watching, at a distance, recalibrating. I could feel their uncertainty. Good, I thought. Let them recalibrate. They were running out of moves, and I hadn't played my hand yet. They came on a Saturday afternoon in February. I saw Harold's car pull into the driveway from the kitchen window, and then I saw the passenger door open and Renee step out. I stood at the window for a moment, watching them walk toward my front door side by side, and I felt a strange, compressed feeling in my chest. Not quite grief, not quite anger. Something older and more complicated than either. I opened the door before they could knock. I had learned over these months that opening the door first is always preferable to waiting. Harold was wearing his good coat and a concerned expression. Renee stood slightly behind him and to the left, which I noticed. It's a positioning that signals deference while still communicating presence. The kind of thing you'd see if you'd spent any time studying classroom dynamics, which I had. They had rehearsed this. "Dorothy," Harold said, "thank you for opening the door. I know this is hard, but I think we need to talk. Just talk. Like reasonable adults." I stepped back and let them into the entryway, but not the living room. I stood with my arms at my sides and waited. Harold spoke first, and he spoke well. I'll give him that. He said he was deeply sorry for the pain he'd caused. He said that his relationship with Renee had grown out of loneliness, not malice. that our marriage had become cold and distant years before anything happened, that we were both responsible for losing each other. He said these things in a measured, sorrowful tone that would have been convincing to someone who hadn't watched him perfect that tone over 4 decades. Then Renee spoke. She said she understood how difficult this must be for me. She said she had enormous respect for me, had always had respect for me. She said that a prolonged court battle would hurt everyone involved, including, she said gently, our grandchildren. She said the word grandchildren with particular care, watching my face as she said it. She was hoping it would land somewhere soft. The children, Harold added, will read the court documents eventually. Everything filed in Common Pleas Court is a matter of public record. Is that what you want for Karen and Michael? For the grandchildren to read in detail about our private? Harold, I said. He stopped. I spent 43 years in a classroom, I said. I know when someone is trying to manage me. I know the difference between an apology and a negotiation dressed up as an apology. And I know that you didn't drive here today out of concern for Karen or Michael or anyone's grandchildren. You drove here because Gerald Park's report has your attorney very worried and you're out of reasonable options. Renee's careful expression flickered. Harold's jaw tightened. You're being vindictive, he said. And the measured tone was gone now, replaced by something flat and cold. You're doing this out of spite, and the court is going to see that. The court, I said, is going to see Gerald Park's report. You'll walk away with the house and a settlement, and that should be enough for a woman your age, Renee said. The word your age arrived with a particular edge to it. Why are you trying to destroy something? What does it get you? Everything that's mine, I said. That's what it gets me. Harold took a step toward me. Not threateningly, not physically, but in the way men sometimes move into a woman's space to remind her of the difference in scale. Old reflex. I didn't step back. I looked at him steadily until he stopped. This will not end well for you, he said quietly. It already hasn't ended well for me, I said. That happened before I found the check. They left. I watched Harold's car back out of the driveway and drive away down the street, and then I closed the front door and leaned my back against it in the hallway. My hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly. Not from weakness, from adrenaline. There's a difference, and it took me a moment to identify it. What I felt was fear, yes, a small and specific fear. What if he meant it? What if there were further moves I hadn't anticipated? But underneath the fear was something steadier and more durable. The knowledge that I was right, that the documents existed, that Sandra was competent and prepared, that I was not alone. The fear, I realized, was actually useful. It reminded me to stay sharp, not to relax, not to assume the battle was already won before the verdict was read. I pushed off the door, went to the kitchen, and called Sandra to tell her what had happened. Good, she said. They're scared. Scared people make mistakes. I hoped she was right. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in March. Sandra and I arrived 40 minutes early. The Franklin County Courthouse is a blocky, functional building that smells of old carpet and recycled air. I had worn my gray wool suit, the one I'd bought for Karen's college graduation years ago, and my good low heels. I had slept 7 hours the night before, which surprised me. Sandra had told me that courtroom composure is the most powerful thing a plaintiff can bring into a hearing, and I had taken that instruction seriously. I had also eaten a proper breakfast. Small disciplines matter when the larger things are out of your control. Harold was already in the corridor when we arrived, standing with Douglas Hearn and a younger associate. He was wearing a tie I didn't recognize. He'd bought new clothes, apparently, for his new life. And he looked, I thought, like a man who had been awake considerably longer than 7 hours. There were shadows under his eyes that his careful grooming couldn't quite conceal. Renee was there too. She had been subpoenaed as a witness. She sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom in a beige blazer, not looking at anyone. Her hands were folded in her lap with a stillness that looked effortful. We did not speak to each other in that corridor. Inside the courtroom, the proceeding was formal and methodical, the way these things are. Nothing like the courtroom dramas people watch on television. Judge Patricia Mercer was a serious woman in her 60s who moved through the proceedings with an efficiency that suggested she had very little patience for theater. She had a reputation, Sandra had told me, for being particularly thorough in asset dissipation cases. I found that comforting. Gerald Park took the stand first. He had prepared a 40-page summary of his forensic accounting findings, and he walked through it item by item in a clear, unhurried voice. The hidden brokerage account, opened 11 years ago, now valued at approximately $440,000. The regular wire transfers to the joint account held by Harold and Renee, totaling, over 9 years, roughly $310,000 in documented marital funds. The cashier's check for $200,000 representing the deposit on 14 Wexford Lane. The full purchase price of the Wexford Lane property, $385,000, of which a substantial portion had originated from the same marital funds. And then the life insurance policy. Gerald read the beneficiary change date into the record 6 years ago and stated the policy value, $850,000, changed from Dorothy Ann Calloway to Renee Patricia Marsh. The courtroom was very quiet. I sat at the plaintiff's table and kept my hands folded and my face composed, and I thought, this is what 43 years of silence looked like, reduced to line items on a forensic accounting report. It was a strange kind of grief, not sharp, but wide. Judge Mercer asked Harold's attorney a question about the source of funds for the brokerage account. Douglas Hearn's answer, that the account had been funded through Harold's personal earnings predating the marriage, was met with Gerald's documentation showing contribution dates, 9 of which fell squarely within the marriage. Harold passed a handwritten note to Hearn. Hearn read it and set it down. I watched Harold watching Gerald, and I could see, in the particular stillness of Harold's face, the precise moment when he understood that the accounting was airtight. His jaw shifted very slightly. His eyes went flat. I had seen that expression before over the years in small moments. When a plan wasn't working, when a conversation wasn't going the direction he'd intended. I had always, previously, tried to smooth things over when I saw that expression. Not today. Renee was called to testify about the Wexford Lane purchase. Sandra had anticipated that Renee might try to claim the $200,000 was a personal gift from Harold, funds he had every right to give. What Renee did not know, what neither Harold nor Douglas Hearn had apparently anticipated, was that Sandra had obtained Renee's own financial records through discovery, and those records showed that Renee had contributed no personal funds whatsoever to the Wexford Lane purchase. The house was paid for entirely by Harold, which meant it was paid for with marital funds. Sandra walked Renee through this on cross-examination with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world. So to confirm, Sandra said, you made no personal financial contribution to the purchase of the property at 14 Wexford Lane? Harold and I had an understanding, Renee began. A yes or no will suffice, Sandra said. Renee looked at Harold. Harold looked at the table. No, Renee said. Judge Mercer wrote something on her notepad. The scratch of her pen in the silence of the courtroom was the loudest thing in the room. Harold testified last. He began in the composed, reasonable manner I recognized from our kitchen, from the living room, from 43 years of conversations in which his being reasonable had functioned as a form of control. He presented himself as a man of good intentions caught in a complicated personal situation. He used the word mutual several times. Mutual distance in the marriage, mutual unhappiness, implying that whatever had happened was the product of two people equally drifting apart. He was even now a persuasive man. I could see it working on the younger associate at Hearn's table, who nodded almost imperceptibly twice. But I could also see Judge Mercer's expression, which was the expression of a person who has heard this particular aria performed before. Sandra asked him one question. "Mr. Calloway, at any point during your relationship with Ms. Marsh, did you disclose to your wife, Dorothy Calloway, the existence of the brokerage account?" He paused. "No." "Did you disclose the beneficiary change on the life insurance policy?" Another pause. "No." "Did you disclose the wire transfers, totaling over $300,000, made to the joint account you held with Ms. Marsh?" Harold looked briefly at his attorney. Hearn gave a microscopic shake of his head. "No," Harold said. The word fell into the courtroom like a stone into still water. "Thank you," Sandra said and sat down. I looked at Judge Mercer. She was looking at Harold with an expression of measured and complete clarity. Not anger, something more considered than that. The expression of a person who has just seen a complete picture and understood it fully. That was the moment I knew. Judge Mercer issued her ruling 14 days after the hearing. Sandra called me at 9:40 in the morning. "It's complete," Sandra said. "Are you sitting down?" I was standing in the garden. "Tell me," I said. The ruling awarded me the marital home in full, with Harold required to deed his interest within 60 days. It awarded me 55% of the known marital assets, the savings accounts, the retirement funds, the joint investment accounts that had been on the books. It awarded me, additionally, 60% of the hidden brokerage account on the grounds that it had been funded substantially through marital contributions, and that Harold's concealment of it constituted financial misconduct. That last point, the concealment finding, was not a small thing. It meant the court had formally characterized Harold's behavior not as private financial management, but as deliberate deception of a spouse. The word misconduct in a judicial ruling carries weight that no private argument ever can. The dissipation claim, the $310,000 in wire transfers, and the $200,000 Wexford Lane deposit, was upheld in full. The court found that Harold had improperly diverted marital assets for the benefit of a third party over a sustained period. He was ordered to compensate the marital estate accordingly, with interest calculated from the date of the first documented transfer. The life insurance policy beneficiary was ordered to revert to the marital estate pending division proceedings. Renee Marsh would receive nothing from it. I stood in the garden and listened to Sandra read through the numbers, and I did the arithmetic slowly in my head, the way you add up something you want to be sure you've understood correctly. After the marital home, after the asset division, after the dissipation compensation, what came to me was a great deal more than $180,000. It was something closer to 9 times that. 9 times the amount Harold had offered me to go away quietly. 9 times what he had judged sufficient for a woman my age who, in his estimation, didn't know what she had and couldn't fight for it if she did. I had been clipping coupons. "Dorothy," Sandra said, "are you still there?" "Yes," I said, "I'm here." "Are you all right?" I looked at my garden. The bulbs I had planted in September, now green and pushing through the late winter soil. Tulips. I'd planted tulips, though at the time I hadn't been entirely sure I'd be in this house come spring. And yet, here they were, entirely indifferent to the question of who owned the soil they were growing in, just doing the quiet work of becoming what they were always going to be. Yes, I said, I think I am. Harold's situation after the ruling was what you might call comprehensively reduced. His attorney's fees had been substantial. Douglas Hearn did not come cheaply, and the complexity of the forensic accounting proceedings had extended the billable hours considerably. The asset division and dissipation compensation left him, by Sandra's estimate, with approximately a third of what he'd had before. And that third was burdened by ongoing legal costs from the appeals process he'd briefly attempted before Hearn had advised him, in terms I can only imagine, to let it go. He had the Wexford Lane house still, but with a mortgage that, at his age, and with his restructured finances, was not comfortable. He retained his pension from the firm, now considerably smaller than it would have been had he not restructured contributions to obscure funds during the marriage. He was, in short, not destitute. But he was no longer the man who had been quietly, methodically, building a second life on money he'd stolen from his first one. The architecture of that second life, which had taken nearly a decade to construct, had come down in 14 days. Renee's situation deserves honesty. She was not purely a villain, and I had not asked for her destruction. She had, in certain respects, been deceived by Harold, too. She had believed he would protect her and her daughter, that the house was secure, that the future was arranged. The court's ruling pulled all of that apart. The Wexford Lane house, purchased with marital funds, became subject to forced sale as part of the dissipation compensation. She was not homeless. She had family. She had income. But the life Harold had described to her, the life that was supposed to be settled and secure, was revealed to be built on foundations that had never been hers to stand on. I wondered sometimes if she understood that Harold had done to her a version of what he had done to me, presented a carefully managed picture of reality that served his purposes and obscured everything that didn't. I thought about the child once or twice in the weeks after the ruling, Harold's daughter, 7 years old and not responsible for any of it. I hoped, quietly, that Renee would find her footing and provide for her properly. That was as much concern as I had the capacity to extend in that direction. My own children's responses were different from each other in ways that were very true to who they are. Karen called the day of the ruling and cried again. But this time, the crying was different. The releasing kind, not the frightened kind. Michael, who had struggled more with the whole situation, was quieter. But he drove over that weekend with his wife, and they took me to dinner at a restaurant I'd wanted to try for years. We talked about things that had nothing to do with Harold. It was the best evening I'd had in a long time. Sandra sent flowers. They were yellow. I put them on the kitchen table and looked at them for a while. I did not feel triumphant, exactly. Triumph suggests you got something you didn't already deserve. What I felt was the particular quiet of a correct thing having been done. The way a room feels after you've finally straightened a picture that's been slightly crooked for years. Not dramatic, not loud, just right. I went to the bank that afternoon and opened 3 new accounts in my name alone. It was the first time in 43 years that I had done so. I sat across from the young banker who processed the paperwork, and when she slid the forms across the desk for my signature, I signed each one slowly and clearly. Dorothy Ann Calloway. My name, my accounts, my future. The banker smiled and asked if there was anything else I needed. No, I said. I think I have everything I need. Spring came properly to Columbus that year, the way it sometimes does in Ohio, all at once, insistent and green, as if making up for lost time. I had the roof replaced in April. The contractor was one of Michael's contacts, and the work took 4 days and cost a fraction of what it would have if I'd waited until the gutters came down. I stood in the backyard on the last afternoon and watched the crew finish up. And I felt something I can only describe as the satisfaction of a house being properly cared for. It had needed that roof for 3 years. Harold had said we couldn't afford it. We could have afforded it 6 times over, as it turned out. I replaced the washing machine too. I went to the appliance store on a Tuesday afternoon and paid for a new one without consulting anyone or weighing the expense against anything else. And the feeling of doing that small thing entirely on my own authority was, I'm embarrassed to say, something close to joy. The delivery men installed it on a Wednesday morning, and I ran a load of laundry that afternoon just to hear it work quietly. No helicopter sounds. No apologizing for wanting a machine that functioned. I want to tell you about the next year, honestly, without making it sound like a fairy tale, because it wasn't a fairy tale. It was just a real life, rebuilt with attention and with the particular deliberateness of someone who has learned, at some cost, what inattention produces. I resumed activities I had quietly abandoned over the years because Harold found them inconvenient or not worth the drive. I went back to the watercolor class at the community center that I'd stopped attending in 2017. The instructor remembered me, which I found unexpectedly moving. My first few paintings back were stiff and uncertain. You could see in the brushwork that I was out of practice, that my hand had forgotten how to move without second-guessing itself. But by the 3rd month, something loosened. I painted the tulips from my garden. I painted the view from Bet's back porch. I painted a street scene from our Vermont trip from memory, and Karen asked if she could have it, and I mailed it to her in a flat envelope with bubble wrap, and she called me when it arrived and said she'd hung it in her kitchen where she could see it every morning. I joined the book club at the public library that met on the 2nd Tuesday of each month. I started having Bet over for dinner on Sunday evenings, a ritual that became one of the fixed, reliable pleasures of my week. I called Karen more often and at better hours. Real conversations rather than the obligatory check-ins we'd settled into over the years. I visited Michael and his family for a long weekend in July and played in the backyard with my grandchildren until my knees reminded me of my age. And then I sat in a lawn chair and watched them and felt the particular happiness of being entirely present in a moment without part of my mind elsewhere. Managing something, worrying about someone else's mood. I also traveled. In September, Karen flew up from Phoenix and we drove together to Vermont to see the foliage. A trip I had wanted to take for 20 years and Harold had always characterized as impractical. We stayed in a small inn in Woodstock, a white clapboard building with a porch and a fireplace in the common room. We walked through town in the mornings and ate at local restaurants in the evenings and talked the way mothers and daughters talk when time and distance and complicated family dynamics have finally been cleared out of the way. Karen told me things about her own marriage, her own fears, her own small daily negotiations that she had never told me before. I think she hadn't been able to, previously. There had always been too much unsaid between us, the weight of what I wasn't acknowledging pressing down on every conversation. Now there was room. It was, I think, the best trip of my life. The financial security was real and stabilizing in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Having accounts that were mine alone, assets that I understood and controlled, meant that I stopped waking at 3 a.m. with that particular cold anxiety about what I would do, what I had, whether it was enough. It was enough. More than enough, in fact, and it had always been there. It had simply been managed by someone with interests other than mine. Harold's trajectory was, from what I learned through occasional necessity, shared accounts to close, paperwork to finalize, the children as an inadvertent information conduit. Less straightforward. The mortgage on Wexford Lane proved exactly as uncomfortable as Sandra had predicted. He had taken on additional consulting work to compensate, at an age when most men his age were scaling down rather than up, and Michael mentioned once carefully that his father sounded tired on the phone. I received that information without comment. Harold had made his choices with full knowledge of what he was doing. Exhaustion was not a punishment I had arranged for him. It was simply the weight of a life restructured under duress, which is heavy for anyone. For he and Renee married quietly about 8 months after the divorce was finalized. I knew because Michael mentioned it in passing, watching my face carefully when he said it. I gave him my most ordinary expression and asked if he wanted more coffee. What Harold and Renee's daily life looked like, I genuinely didn't know, and the remarkable thing was how little I found myself wanting to know. There were, according to Karen, who heard from Michael, who heard from Harold's sister, ongoing tensions. Money, the children from the first marriage, the particular resentments that accumulate when a life that was supposed to represent a new beginning turns out to have its own ledger of difficulties and costs. I felt no satisfaction in these details, and I mean that without performance. The satisfaction I carried was of a different and more durable kind, the satisfaction of a decision correctly made, of a woman correctly defended, of a life reclaimed rather than simply survived. Patricia joined the book club in October and immediately became its most opinionated member, which I considered an asset. Sujin started teaching a beginner Korean cooking class at the community center, and I signed up for it without deliberating. And I now know how to make a respectable japchae and a very decent doenjang jjigae, which I consider genuine accomplishments for a woman who previously thought her culinary ambitions were permanently settled. Bet and I saw a film together on a Friday evening and disagreed pleasantly about it all the way home, and then continued the disagreement over tea on my porch. And it was one of those evenings that feels, while it's happening, like exactly what life is supposed to be. At 69, I was living more fully than I had at 55. More fully, if I'm honest, than I had at 45. The years I had spent making myself smaller had, it turned out, not consumed me. They had only been years, and there were, I intended, quite a few more ahead. I found that worth noting. I found it worth saying out loud. I spent 43 years making myself smaller so someone else could feel larger. I want you to know, I don't say that with bitterness. I say it so that if you recognize yourself in it, you can choose differently while there's still time. Know what you own. Know what you're owed. Don't confuse loyalty with surrender. If you had reached into that coat pocket and found that check, what would you have done? Would you have had the courage to drive to Wexford Lane? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this story stayed with you, please subscribe. It means more than you know. Thank you for listening.